GDP should also be shrinking in some sense because this is a shrinking economy. And therefore, a true recession will be one where growth falls below, say, -2 rather than 0. And that's because we're not taking into account the effects of population aging. Every time Japan declares its GDP numbers, there's a lot of panic in the world because the GDP growth numbers look low. But perhaps they should be low because the population, in fact, is shrinking and we don't adjust for that. This is another long way of saying that we have not fully taken into account the effects of population aging in thinking about economies and what they should be doing. Of course, for India, population aging is some distance away. But there are a number of other countries in the world, certainly China, where the great fear is China will grow old before it grows rich, that it will not have the resources to support the increasingly old people in that economy. And of course, China, the effects of population aging have been much more accentuated because of the one-child policy in the past. So these are concerns that a number of industrial countries, but as well as some emerging markets are facing, and could explain to some extent the slowdown in final demand. People who are growing older are worried and are saving more rather than spending. There's another facet which is observable in a number of industrial countries over and above population aging, that is slow productivity growth. Now, this is a hard to understand factor because what is productivity? Productivity is the ability to make more with the same resources, okay? With the same human beings working, with the same capital, you actually have greater output. How do you get greater productivity? You get greater productivity by doing things in a more clever way, by bringing process innovations, by bringing technical innovations in which allow you to automate and produce more. Okay? Now, if you read the newspapers, if you read the magazines, it seems like we are living in an age of great productivity. Right? There's innovations every day. The whole internet is an innovation. Everything on the internet is an innovation. So with all this innovation happening, innovation in medical technologies, now people are looking for the secret of aging and whether we can actually prevent aging altogether and grow up to, I think one billionaire wants to live to the age of 10,000. So people are looking for these kinds of things and it seems within reach. We are sending spacecraft to the stars now. There's some talk about sending them at a quarter of the speed of light. So if that is realized, we could actually have a spacecraft at a star during our lifetimes. These are the kinds of things that are being talked about. Yet, from an economic perspective, we don't see it in the numbers. We don't see that we're producing things in a more clever, in a more effective, efficient way. So what's really going on? Why is there so much innovation, yet we don't see it in the numbers? And I would argue there are at least 4 explanations. One is we're simply measuring things wrong. Okay? And what do I mean by this? The cars that we used yesterday, or 10 years ago, are far inferior to the cars that we use today. The cars that are produced in India, you will see, are state-of-the-art, lots of interesting gadgets. They're all taken for granted, while this car 10 years ago didn't have any of this and was probably much worse in terms of mileage. But when we count cars, we don't adjust for the superior quality. So even though a car today is probably 1.2, 1.3 times the car yesterday, we still measure it as one car. So if we don't take quality improvements into account, we undermeasure growth. And that may be one reason why we don't see productivity numbers going up, because we're not taking the improved quality of products into account. That's one explanation. A second explanation is many of the innovations we have today actually may be hard to monetize. And what do I mean by that? GDP is a concept which only measures things that you pay for. Okay? And there was an old statement in Paul Samuelson's book which paraphrased basically said that when a wealthy lady marries her chauffeur, GDP goes down. Why does that happen? Because now her chauffeur becomes her husband and drives her everywhere without asking for pay. And as a result, his salary is no longer counted in GDP numbers. GDP has gone down. The goods and services that are produced in the economy have not changed, but GDP has gone down. Now, how does this particular statement help us understand why productivity may be going down? Think of what you do on the internet. Okay, on a hot afternoon like today is here, you would have gone to the movies and paid for your movie ticket and sat in the movie hall in air-conditioned comfort. And because, certainly this was the case when I was young in Delhi, the longer the movie the better, because the more you got to sit in the air-conditioned hall. You used to do that, but nowadays what you do is spend the afternoon, on the web, maybe YouTube, maybe some other service, and you're perfectly happy because you're seeing everything that you wanted to see. You no longer want to go to the movie theater, so your leisure activities are as good, except you're paying nothing for it. Earlier you used to pay the movie hall. Maybe you pay a little for data, but that's very small. So the point is that the new activities are still not monetized. There's a lot of content being created, but people aren't getting paid for it. And as a result, what happens is that we get under measurement, because we're not measuring the value you're attributing to those leisure activities on the net, while we see clearly that you're not going to the cinema hall anymore in the quantity that you used to go. So that's the monetization problem. A third reason productivity may be low is that the efforts to save the industrial economies post-crisis have proved too successful. One of the virtues of downturns are similar to the virtues of forest fires in a national park, in a national reservation. What forest fires do is they clean out the underbrush and make it harder for a forest fire to happen again. Okay, that's why the new sort of technology for forest fires is to let at least some of it burn, so that it makes the forest less susceptible to burning down the line. Similarly, downturns have a cleansing effect. That is, they put some poorly performing firms, cause them to close down, and therefore create space for new firms to come up, new firms to grow. Now, post-financial crisis, what we've had across the world is very, very low interest rates, a very accommodative environment, perhaps, for existing entities. Of course, I wouldn't say finance has been very easy, but it's been easier than otherwise because of the very aggressive monetary policies. And this perhaps has made it easier for firms to stay in business rather than go out of business because they're not being that productive. This has also preserved jobs, low productivity jobs, and as a result we may not see the productivity increases. Now, I'm not passing a value judgment whether this is good or bad, but it could explain to some extent why we're not seeing strong productivity growth, because in a sense the economies are sort of full of older firms that are still hanging on, and why we may not see investment, because the younger firms don't see the space to invest and grow because of the existing firms. The last aspect, and of course there are many more reasons one could attribute, this is all researchers are still trying to understand. Last reason why productivity the world over may not reflect what we see in terms of innovation around us is perhaps the oligopoly problem. And this is a point that The Economist has been harping on for some time, which is across the world the new technologies tend to create oligopolies. If you think about the networks, network effects typically mean that the entity that benefits from those network effects tends to dominate. Take, for example, Facebook as a social media operation, or Google as a search engine. Typically, the larger they are, the more connected they are, the more valuable they are, and more people want to be on them. So the new technologies have the effect of encouraging oligopolies, and oligopolies, however innovative they may be earlier on, over time tend to exploit their oligopoly and sit on innovation. So a number of these entities, large entities, are buying up smaller potential competitors before they can prove a competitive threat and shutting them down. Sometimes not even using their technologies, but preventing them from posing a competitive threat. And this may be part of the reason why we're not seeing strong productivity growth. One could argue that this is also true of things like patents for pharmaceuticals, patents for intellectual property. Those also prevent stronger growth down the line. So, given all this, whatever the reason, and I have to tell you, there's a lot of debate amongst economists, but there is no clear reason for why we're growing so slowly, and it could be a combination of many reasons. But in this environment, what should we do? And I would argue the response takes really two forms. One set of people say what we should do is undertake structural reforms. And I would probably put myself in that camp, that even though we don't understand fully why we are in this situation, let us undertake the reforms in country after country that will elevate our potential growth and make us grow faster. And whatever the reason, elevating the potential of the economy has to be beneficial and lead to stronger growth. And this means increasing the degree of competition in the economy, increasing the participation of hitherto excluded elements, such as in many countries women, such as weaker sections of society, trying to essentially bring more people, more capital to work in the labor force. Also includes things like financial sector reforms, which we are trying to do in this country. So these kinds of reforms would elevate potential growth. We could also think about these factors that I talked about which might be holding back growth. For example, if across the world we have large oligopolies which are potentially holding back growth, we should talk about whether there's a need to essentially create more competition in those kinds of industries. But typically, the response to this talk of structural reforms in a number of countries is it's very difficult. It's politically difficult to undertake these reforms. For example, in a number of countries, labor market reforms, because the labor markets are too inflexible. France is an example. Labor market reforms are proposed as a way to create more flexibility, to create more potential for growth, but clearly those reforms affect incumbent workers and they've been opposed. In a number of countries across the world, you must have seen tussle between these taxi aggregators and the taxi cab owners. There are fights like this in every part of the world, and as a result, structural reforms are not going at the pace that could create stronger growth. As a result, a number of countries are looking at something different, some form of stimulus. Now, what is stimulus? Stimulus typically means that either you spend more, that is government fiscal stimulus. The government spends because the household is not spending, the corporation is not spending, the government spends. Or alternatively, you have monetary stimulus, which is you cut interest rates to the bone, and you hope as a result, because interest rates are really low, people borrow and buy goods, or people borrow and invest. And so you create either consumption or investment. Now, the problem, of course, is that a number of countries did spend through their governments, but ran out of fiscal space. The average debt to GDP in a number of industrial countries exceeds 100%. With that level of debt, essentially, it becomes quite dangerous to increase debt more by spending through the government. And increasingly, people, when they see that spending, are bound to ask, who's going to pay for all this? And if later I'm going to be taxed to pay for the higher debt that the government has accumulated, I'm going to be starting to save more today, knowing that the taxes down the line are going to be higher. So this is a theory which is often called Ricardian equivalence, but the notion is that at high levels of debt, perhaps government spending may be offset to some extent by the private sector households getting more anxious about the future and saving more. As a result of all this, a lot of the burden of stimulus has fallen on monetary policy. Monetary policy across the world has essentially pushed really hard on the accelerator. And today in a number of countries, interest rates are at zero. Not just zero, they're going negative. What does a negative interest rate mean? It means you pay the bank for the privilege of taking your money.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.